Hi guys, welcome back. If you grew up watching Battle of the Planets in the late 1970s or early 1980s, you probably remember it as one of the coolest cartoons on television. Five young heroes in bird-themed costumes, a giant transforming spacecraft called the Phoenix, an underwater headquarters, and a masked villain who showed up every week with another insane plan to conquer Earth. It was colorful, fast, exciting, and for a lot of Western viewers, it was their first real exposure to Japanese animation, even if they did not know it at the time. The show became a huge success. It sold toys, comics, lunchboxes, and helped create an audience for anime years before most people in America even knew what anime was. But there was one small detail. Battle of the Planets was not actually the original show. Underneath it was a completely different series called Science Ninja Team Gatchaman, a 105-episode Japanese production created by Tatsunoko Productions years earlier. When American distributor Sandy Frank Entertainment licensed the series, they did not simply translate it, they rebuilt it. Entire episodes disappeared, the dialogue was rewritten from scratch, characters were altered, deaths were removed, motivations were changed. An entirely new robot was invented whose main job was to stand around explaining why nobody had died. The result was fascinating because Battle of the Planets and Gatchaman often used the exact same animation footage. The same explosions, the same battles, the same characters, the same spaceship. Yet somehow, they told completely different stories. One was a bright children's adventure cartoon. The other was a surprisingly dark war story filled with trauma, sacrifice, identity crises, terrorism, and people making genuinely horrible choices. Once you watch both versions back to back, it is honestly shocking how much meaning was removed while the visuals stayed exactly the same. Battle of the Planets was a great cartoon, but Gatchaman was something else entirely. It was darker, stranger, and honestly a lot more interesting. So today, let's look at some of the biggest and most disturbing differences between them.
A thing like that can't just disappear, but the screen is blank.
The robot who existed to explain why nobody died. Let's start with the funniest example, because the solution Sandy Frank came up with was honestly kind of genius and ridiculous at the same time. In Gatchaman, cities got attacked, factories exploded, military bases were destroyed, civilian areas were hit, and people died. Not constantly and not in an overly graphic way, but the show made it clear that warfare had consequences. When Galactor launched an attack, there were actually human beings living in those locations, and the destruction mattered because people were caught in it. American television in 1978 wanted absolutely none of that. So, Sandy Frank's version created an entirely new character called Seven Zark 7. He did not exist anywhere in Gatchaman, not even for a second. He was invented for Battle of the Planets, and his job was to sit inside Center Neptune and explain things to the audience. More importantly, his job was to explain away death. Before major attacks, Seven Zark 7 often announced that civilians had already been evacuated. Everybody had reached safety. Everybody was fine. There was nothing to worry about. Then the episode cut directly to footage of entire cities being blown apart. The same footage from Gatchaman, the same explosions, the same destruction. But now the audience had been informed that nobody was actually there, so naturally, the problem was solved, at least according to television standards. And because edited episodes sometimes ended up too short after violent or darker scenes were removed, Seven Zark 7 received even more screen time. He even got a robot dog companion named One Rover 1, who contributed almost nothing to the story. His purpose was mostly to fill time. That was the strange thing about Seven Zark 7. A lot of viewers remembered him as a character, but he was not really designed as one. He was a censorship tool, a narrative bandage, an emergency patch applied over footage that could no longer mean what it originally meant. Every time Seven Zark 7 announced that an area had been safely evacuated, he was covering for footage where the original show clearly wanted the audience to understand that people were in danger or worse. He was not really a character. He was an alibi with a face. And the fact that Sandy Frank created an entirely new character instead of simply cutting all the footage tells you something important. There was so much violence and destruction in Gatchaman that removing it all would have damaged the structure of the episodes themselves. So instead, they changed what the footage meant. The villain lost the most important thing about them. Now we get into one of the biggest differences of all, and honestly one of the most fascinating villains in 1970s animation. In Battle of the Planets, the main villain was Zoltar. He was a masked enemy commander. He wore a cape, made dramatic speeches, failed, escaped, and returned the following week. Pretty standard Saturday morning villain stuff. In Gatchaman, the character was Berg Katse, and Berg Katse was an entirely different figure. According to the original story, Katse was created by Sosai X through the fusion of male and female fraternal twins while they were still embryos. The result was a mutant human being who could shift between male and female presentations. This was not a random detail. It was not just a visual gimmick. It was not simply added for shock value. It was central to the character. Katse's unstable identity was directly connected to their tragedy. Sosai X did not create Katse out of love. He created Katse as a weapon, a tool, and an experiment. Katse never truly got to choose who they were. That choice was taken away before they were even born. The characters spent their entire life serving the being that engineered them, trying to earn approval from the very force responsible for their suffering. That made Katse genuinely tragic, despite all the terrible things they did. Katse committed horrible crimes, but you could see how they became what they became. In Battle of the Planets, nearly all of this vanished. Zoltar became male. Female appearances were either removed, changed, or explained away. Sometimes the American version tried to explain certain footage by claiming Zoltar had a sister named Mala, which mostly just made everything more confusing. It was a patch placed over footage that originally had a completely different meaning. The result was that American audience never really met Berg Katse. They met a simplified replacement, a villain who wore Katse's costume but lost the central idea that made the character unique. And remember, we are talking about a Japanese animated series from 1972. A show explored sex-shifting identity, body experimentation, and engineered suffering through a villain decades before most Western children's cartoons would even go near anything similar. Removing that did not simplify the character. It removed the character. Battle of the Planets gave you a villain who lost every week. Gatchaman gave you someone engineered to suffer from birth by the same being they were forced to serve. These are not the same character. One version escaped forever, the other chose death. The differences become even bigger when you look at how both versions handled the ending of the villain's story, because one version had an ending and the other basically did not. Near the end of Gatchaman, Sosai X finally reveals the truth about his larger plan and Katse's place in it. Katse realizes that they were never a partner, a trusted lieutenant, or even a respected ally. They were property, a tool created by Sosai X and used for his convenience. Once Katse finally understands that, they make a final choice. Katse chooses death rather than continued service. That moment is extremely dark for a 1970s animated series, but it is also powerful because it completes the character's arc. Everything in Katse's life has been building toward that final act of defiance. After a life controlled by another being, death becomes the only choice Katse fully owns. Now compare that to Zoltar. In Battle of the Planets, Zoltar constantly escaped. He escaped in the early episodes, he escaped in the middle of the series, and he escaped whenever defeat felt certain. He would lose, retreat, and come back again another week. The reason was simple. American children's television preferred recurring villains, and recurring villains needed to stay alive. As a result, Zoltar's survival removed the sense of consequence. Nothing truly changed. Nothing moved forward. The story never reached a meaningful conclusion for him. Katse's death gave meaning to the character's journey because it brought that journey to an end. Zoltar's constant survival preserved the status quo and kept the story running in circles. One show was moving toward a conclusion. The other was moving toward next week's episode. Zoltar lived because the show needed him next week. Katse died because the story had been building toward that moment for years. The Fire Phoenix was basically a controlled suicide attack. One of the coolest things in both shows was the Phoenix attack. You know the one. The ship bursts into flames, transforms into a giant fiery bird, and charges directly at the enemy. It looks awesome, but in Gatchaman, it was also terrifying. The attack was called the Firebird, or Fire Phoenix depending on the translation, and using it was not safe at all. Several episodes made it clear that the technique was dangerous for the heroes themselves. After using it, the team could be exhausted, physically drained, and barely able to continue. Sometimes they looked like they had survived a major accident. The message was consistent. This attack cost something. The team was not simply activating a special move. They were risking their lives every single time. That was what made the attack meaningful. Victory required sacrifice, and the strongest weapon came with the highest price. In Battle of the Planets, the same footage appeared. The same transformation, the same fire effects, the same animation, but the framing changed and the danger largely disappeared. The fiery phoenix became more like a finishing move. It was the thing the heroes used when it was time for the villain's giant machine to explode. It looked spectacular, but it did not feel frightening because the audience already knew everyone would be okay. The animation was almost identical. The meaning was completely different. That is one of the most interesting things about comparing these shows. Nobody had to change the visuals, they only had to change the context. And context changed everything. In Gatchaman, the Fire Phoenix felt desperate. In Battle of the Planets, it felt cool. In Gatchaman, the team was betting their lives. In Battle of the Planets, the effects budget was just getting a workout. Jason was missing the reason he behaved that way. If you only watched Battle of the Planets, Jason probably seemed pretty straightforward. He was the rebellious one, the hothead of the team, the cool guy who argued with Mark and pushed back against authority. It was fairly standard team dynamic for an action cartoon, but Jason's original counterpart, Joe Asakura, was a much darker and more complicated character. Joe's parents were connected to Galactor, but eventually turned against the organization. Galactor killed them, and Joe was shaped by that loss. From that point onward, revenge became the center of his life. Joe was not reckless because he was naturally aggressive. He was reckless because he did not value his own survival very much. And that is a huge difference. Throughout Gatchaman, Joe repeatedly puts himself in danger. He takes insane risks. He charges into situations he should avoid. He pushes himself beyond reasonable limits. Underneath all of it is a character who seems strangely comfortable with dying, not because he simply wants death, but because he wants revenge more than he wants life. That is a genuinely damaged protagonist, and the show knows he is damaged. The audience is supposed to know it too. Battle of the Planets removed most of that context. Without the backstory, Jason's behavior became just personality. He was the rebellious guy, the cool one, the rule breaker. The trauma disappeared. What was left was an archetype. Joe was a person. Jason was a role. And that difference matters because characters became more interesting when their actions come from emotional wounds rather than television formulas. Battle of the Planets gave you a rebel. Gatchaman gave you someone who spent years running toward danger, because danger looked a lot like the thing he had been chasing all along. Some episodes were so difficult to adapt that they were left out. Here is something many viewers never realized. Battle of the Planets did not adapt all of Gatchaman, not even close. The original Japanese series had 105 episodes, while Battle of the Planets produced 85 episodes using material from the original. That means a large chunk of the Japanese series was never adapted into the American version, and the missing episodes were not just random filler. Many contained material that would have been extremely difficult to sanitize, including higher casualty counts, darker emotional consequences, more complex Berg-Katse material, and situations where the meaning could not be easily patched over with a quick line from Seven Zark 7. Some episodes could be edited and reworked for American television. Others were easier to leave out completely. This created an unusual problem. American viewers were sometimes watching characters whose development depended on stories they had never really seen. Important pieces of characterization disappeared. Motivations became weaker. Certain relationships lost context. It was like reading a novel with several chapters missing. You could still follow the main plot, but some emotional moments would suddenly feel incomplete or confusing because crucial pieces of the story were gone. That is essentially what happened with Battle of the Planets. It was not just a censored version of Gatchaman, it was also an incomplete one. And unfortunately, many of the missing pieces were among the most interesting parts of the original series. The mentor actually faced consequences. Most children's action cartoons protected mentor characters. They gave orders, offered advice, and stayed safe while the heroes handled the danger. Dr. Nambu did not always have that protection. In Gatchaman, Nambu was more than just a commander. He was essentially the team's father figure, the man who recruited them, trained them, and guided them through their missions. For some of the team members, he was the closest thing they had to a parent, and the show put him in real danger. Galactor targeted him directly, including in episodes built around attempts to assassinate him. These were not just throwaway threats. The team had to face the possibility that the person guiding them could be taken away. That changed the emotional feel of the story. In Battle of the Planets, Chief Anderson remained far more protected. He usually served as the reliable authority figure, calmly giving orders from Center Neptune and staying safely behind the scenes. Once again, Gatchaman reminded viewers that war affects everyone, not just soldiers and heroes. In Gatchaman, Dr. Nambu could become a target. In Battle of the Planets, Chief Anderson mostly stayed in his chair. One felt like a war story, the other felt like a workplace. The villains were human beings. This was perhaps one of the most uncomfortable changes in the adaptation. In Battle of the Planets, Spectra was presented as an alien enemy force. They were invaders from another world, outsiders who threatened Earth. The setup was simple: good guys versus alien bad guys. In Gatchaman, Galactor was largely made up of human beings. These were real people who had joined the organization for different reasons. Some were recruited, some were manipulated. Some genuinely believed in the cause. Others were simply looking for money, power, or a way out of difficult circumstances. But regardless of their reasons, they were still human. And that changed everything. Suddenly, every battle carried a different weight. Ken was not just fighting monsters or alien creatures, he was fighting people. People who had chosen the wrong path, been pushed toward it, or become trapped inside a dangerous organization. That made the enemy far more uncomfortable to think about, which is exactly why the idea worked so well. Human beings are capable of creating terrible organizations. History has shown that many times. Galactor reflected that reality in a way Spectra never did. By turning the enemy into aliens, Battle of the Planets created emotional distance between the audience and the conflict. Gatchaman removed that distance by making the enemy human. As a result, the story became much harder to ignore, and much more powerful. Making the enemy alien is one of the oldest tricks in adventure storytelling. It lets you fight a war without thinking too much about who is on the other side. Gatchaman did not give viewers that comfort. The people destroying cities in Gatchaman were not alien. They were people.
Well, I guess I won't go home in disgrace after all.
The real mastermind was much stranger than a typical cartoon villain. The luminous one in Battle of the Planets was fairly straightforward. He was the ultimate villain, the final boss behind the invasion and the mastermind pulling the strings. His goal was easy to understand. He wanted to defeat the heroes and take control. Sosai X was much stranger and far more unsettling. In Gatchaman, conquering Earth never seemed to be his only goal. At several points, the series suggested that humanity itself was being studied, observed, tested, and used. Because of that, the conflict often felt less like a simple invasion and more like an experiment. Human lives became pieces on a board. Galactor was a tool. Katsei was a tool. In many ways, everyone was a tool. That is what made Sosai X so disturbing. He did not think like a human being. He did not seem to value people, including his own followers. What mattered to him was whether someone was useful. Once that usefulness disappeared, so did his interest. The way he treated Katsei made that very clear. To Sosai X, Katsei was never family, a trusted lieutenant, or a real partner. Katsei was simply equipment, created for a purpose. The Luminous One wanted to win. Sosai X felt like something operating according to rules humans could never fully understand. And that was honestly much creepier. Keyop's weird origin was completely invented. Now, let's talk about Keyop, or more specifically, the noises. You know the noises, the chirping, the beeping, and all the strange sounds that somehow became his most recognizable trait. In Gatchaman, the character was Jinpei, and he was simply a kid. He was an orphan taken in and raised by Jun, which gave their relationship a genuine emotional connection. He spoke normally. He acted like a normal child. He served as the emotional little brother figure of the team. Then Battle of the Planets decided to make things much stranger. Suddenly, Keyop became a biosynthetic human, a laboratory-created being. His unusual speech patterns were explained as part of this artificial origin story. None of that existed in Gatchaman. Jinpei was not a laboratory creation, and he certainly did not communicate through a series of strange noises. That entire backstory was invented for the American version. Jinpei was easy to understand because he was simply a kid trying to survive in a dangerous world alongside older teammates. Keyop, on the other hand, became more of a gimmick than an actual person. In Gatchaman, Jinpei was basically the team's little brother. In Battle of the Planets, Keyop was apparently built in a laboratory and communicated through a series of bloop, bloop, bleep noises. One character felt like a real person. The other felt like somebody lost a bet in the writer's room. One story reached a conclusion, the other just ended. Finally, we come to the biggest difference of all. One of these shows actually had an ending, the other did not. Gatchaman built toward a final confrontation. The final conflict reached its climax. Characters suffered, sacrifices were made, people got hurt. The cost of victory became real and impossible to ignore. Most importantly, the story reached a conclusion because it had been designed to reach one. Everything had been building toward a final destination. Battle of the Planets never really got there. Instead, the series simply stopped. There was no definitive ending, no final showdown, no ultimate resolution, and no true conclusion for Zoltar. The reason was fairly simple. The American adaptation was built for syndication and episodic television. The conflict could continue as long as episodes were being produced, and as long as the conflict continued, more episodes could be sold. Because of that, the story never needed a final conclusion. But endings matter. An ending tells viewers what a story was ultimately trying to say. It gives meaning to everything that came before it. That is where Gatchaman separated itself from Battle of the Planets. It had a destination, a purpose, and a final statement. Battle of the Planets had a format, and those are not the same thing. Battle of the Planets did not really end. Gatchaman did. And if you are trying to figure out which version was telling the complete story, that is probably your answer. The interesting thing about Battle of the Planets is that it did not destroy Gatchaman. That would have been a much simpler story. Instead, it did something far stranger. It borrowed Gatchaman's visuals while replacing much of what the original series was trying to say. The bird costume stayed, the god phoenix stayed, the action scene stayed, the explosion stayed, but underneath all of that, the themes and ideas changed dramatically. To be fair, Sandy Frank was not working without limitation. American children's television in 1978 had very strict standards. A tragic, sex-shifting villain was not going to make it through network television. A hero with a death wish was not going to make it through either. Civilian casualties, darker themes, and a story that constantly reminded viewers that war destroys lives were also unlikely to survive the adaptation process intact. The people behind Battle of the Planets were not necessarily trying to ruin a classic. They were trying to make a Japanese television series fit into an American broadcasting system that simply was not prepared for what Gatchaman was doing. But when both versions are viewed today, the difference between them becomes impossible to ignore. They used the same footage, the same heroes, the same spaceship, and many of the same battles. Yet they ended up telling two very different stories. One became the show millions of people remembered growing up with. The other was the story hiding underneath it all along. And that is exactly what makes the comparison so fascinating. Battle of the Planets was not just a censored version of Gatchaman. It was almost an alternate universe version of it, created from the same animation. If you have never watched the original Gatchaman, it is worth checking out. Not because it will ruin your childhood or make you dislike Battle of the Planets, but because it is genuinely surprising. You might start watching it expecting the cartoon you remembered, only to slowly realize you are looking at something darker, stranger, and far more ambitious than most people ever told you. The same 5 heroes, the same bird suits, the same fiery spaceship, but in the end, they were fighting a completely different war.